Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next in our series of webinars. This is a rebroadcast of our latest webinar. Notice that's a rebroadcast because I think I forgot to hit the record button when we recorded this live. So the good news for those of you listening in is it should be a little bit shorter. The bad news is you don't get to take advantage of all the feedback that we got throughout the first webinar. So let's get started. We got a pretty busy screen. Just wanted to remind everybody that the purpose of these webinars and the tip videos is to bring evidence-based and research-based information to your desktop that you can use for coalition evaluation. I know that there's a lot of information out there, and some of it can be confusing. Some of that information is better than other pieces of information. So it's our hope that we can bring you the best possible information in a format that's easy to use. As always, if you have any questions or comments, I'll provide for you contact information at the end, and also think about some ideas for webinars that you think you might like to see or that you think that your coalition might need. So the title of this webinar is Conducting Your Evaluation, a Framework for Community Coalitions. This was a webinar that was selected by folks who gave us ideas from the other webinars that we were doing. There was a lot of questions about how exactly do I conduct my evaluation? What are the steps for an evaluation? And that's what we're going to talk about today. I am Dr. Bill Geary, founder of Global Evaluation Solutions. I'm the host of this webinar series, which is being brought to you by coalitionevaluation.com and Global Evaluation Solutions. For those of you who don't know me, I have 18 years of program community coalition evaluation experience. Most recently, the former deputy director of evaluation and research at CADCA's National Coalition Institute. And I have also coordinated two different coalitions, one a suburban coalition and one an urban coalition. So it's an honor to be able to provide this information for you today. The agenda for the webinar was as follows. We are in the middle of the introduction. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the framework, which is going to be brought to you through the Centers for Disease Control. They have a framework that they use based on some of the information that we've already provided in some of our other webinars. It is considered a best practice. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that framework looks like overall. We're going to review the JC standards. For those of you who remember, the Joint Committee on Standards for Educational Evaluation provides, again, best practices for what a good evaluation should look like. Then we're going to go over the CDC framework in a little more detail. We're going to talk about each evaluation step. We're going to provide information on the rationale or the overall purpose for that step. And then we're going to talk about some sample action steps that would occur during that phase of the framework. Finally, we're going to get into a section called Telling the Coalition Stories. So this information hopefully will be more useful to you as you move forward. This is certainly information that can be helpful beyond just laying out what the steps of a good evaluation should be. So let's get started. There's the CDC framework. If you do a Google search for CDC Evaluation Framework, this is the page that will bring you to. A couple of things I wanted to point out about what you're looking at right now. First, the page will not be identical to what you see now. What I did is I kind of froze this image and provided some learning tools on this page for us to go through during this presentation. Also, I wanted to point out, you might notice that in the upper left-hand corner, it does say it's a framework for program evaluation. I think it's really important to clarify what the CDC means when they refer to that, because I know that there are some folks, some organizations and agencies out there who try to distinguish between what's called kind of community-based programs versus individually based. And that's how the CDC views it, right? That they are actually all programs. If we think about the social ecology model, right, there's kind of the individual level, there's the small group level, and a lot of people, when they think of programs, that's what they think of. They think of some type of maybe classroom-based program. The CDC, however, refers to that, but in addition says that this framework is also applicable for broader community level when you're trying to address, for example, policy changes, when you're trying to address community risk factors, things like that. So I just wanted to clarify the language just so everybody knows that this framework was not written just for what we would refer to as individual or small group programs, that it does apply to coalitions and the kinds of long-term, broad-based prevention strategies that they are engaged in. Next, you may notice that in the middle of this framework are standards: utility, feasibility, propriety, and accuracy. For those of you who remember our other webinar, these are the JC, Joint Community Standards for Educational Evaluation standards, and that is these are the 4 categories of standards that should be applied to every evaluation, and the CDC bases their framework on these 4 standards. So we're going to start with a really quick review of what these standards are, because it's important to know what they are if we're going to take this information in context. So we'll start with utility standards. And utility standards address the issue: is the evaluation useful and meaningful for stakeholders? The next standard is feasibility standard. And this is the area where the question is the evaluation effective and is it efficient? Are you conducting your evaluation in the most efficient way possible, but also is it an evaluation that is useful for you? For utility, propriety, our evaluation process is fair, legal, proper, and just. And then the last set of standards fall under accuracy: our evaluation representations, propositions, and findings dependable and truthful. So those are the 4 standards upon which this framework is built. And when we conducted the webinar, we did get some feedback asking people how they identify stakeholders and reminding them that this wheel, that some people may have familiarity with this wheel, and that was pointed out during the webinar as well, because if you're working under, say, a strategic prevention framework approach, you also have a wheel, although it looks like a flower, that you're working on, and capacity is the first step of that. And so we don't want to confuse the actual process of conducting the program with the process of conducting the evaluation. So while it is true you have to engage stakeholders, for example, to increase your capacity in order to move through the strategic prevention framework, within this context, we're going to talk about engaging stakeholders just for the purposes of the evaluation. So certainly some of those stakeholders will overlap in both processes, but there also might be folks that are a little bit different in this one. So we asked folks to identify who stakeholders were, or how are they able to do that? And most people said that they identified stakeholders by people who might have an interest or who might be impacted by what is happening. So we want to start there. How do we engage stakeholders? And the first is, in fact, to identify who the stakeholders are for the evaluation. There are some guidelines to think about who should be involved in the evaluation as a stakeholder. We're going to think about who's involved in the day-to-day operations of the implementation of the program, right? So we might include staff, for example, volunteers who are helping us. Who are the folks that are the focus of the change we're trying to get to? For example, are we trying to get retail outlet folks to card, right? When people are trying to buy alcohol, are we trying to get parents to stop hosting parties, right? So those would be the focus of the change. We also are interested in the idea of increasing the credibility and visibility of our evaluation. So are there folks in the community who might have an interest in the evaluation because they can help us do that? Because certainly if we're going to go through all this trouble of conducting a good evaluation, we want to make sure that the community knows that we are serious about evaluating our work. And so are there folks who can help relay the message of credibility, but also help us gain more visibility of the evaluation itself? Are there folks who can help institutionalize the standards, institutionalize the evaluation findings that we're involved in 2 levels, right? First, we want to be able to think about, are there people that we need to have on board that will help us keep the evaluation going, right? Institutionalize it in the sense of it becomes part of the day-to-day work of the coalition or the group that's conducting the program. The other is no doubt these findings are going to be used, particularly at the community level, to potentially lead to some type of broad policy changes. So are there people that we need to involve in the evaluation because they can help us institutionalize those types of policy recommendations? And then finally, we are going to look to include people who fund or authorize the work. Obviously, this is so they know what's going on with the money that they are spending. So these are the folks that we would identify as stakeholders. It's important to think about who these folks are. So the first step is to identify who they are. The second step then is to clarify what their interests are in the evaluation. Part of that is delineating why we think they should be at the table, given the list that we just went over. Is there a specific role that they may play based on that list? But we also want to think about what their interests might be. What might they want to know? For example, are there specific pieces of the evaluation that are of interest to the funders? Are there specific pieces of the evaluation that may be applicable to parents who either are or not part of the change? So we want to be able to clarify their interests. We did ask folks, how do you think you should be? Well, how do you think you can do that? Well, obviously we're involved in coalition work, so the obvious answer is you would just sit down with them and ask them and record them and then make sure that your recordings are accurate. Part of that conversation then would involve the next step, which is showing them the benefit of the evaluation, right? What can they get out of it? We are trying to increase their willingness to participate and to work with us. That's part of the institutionalization and part of the increasing our capacity and sustainability part. So showing them how it helps them. And then the last piece is pointing out to them directly what role they may have in the evaluation. How can they help with the evaluation process? So we have a 4-step process beginning with identifying who they are, and then the last step is showing them how they can help us obtain our evaluation goals. So that's engaging stakeholders. So the next piece then is, after we've engaged stakeholders, we think about who should be involved in the evaluation, and we've tried to clarify their interests, show them how they can be helpful. Next, we want to very carefully, I guess, delineate what the program is for them, and specifically talk a little bit about what we're trying to change. What does that look like, right? What is the problem? How's this program going to help us? So the steps to this would be, first, identify the needs that are to be addressed. Why are we all coming to the table and having these conversations? The second is to clarify what I refer to as the theory of change. So some of this language I've kind of adapted on my own and taken multiple ideas from the CDC and tried to focus them in on single ideas. So the theory of change, of course, talks about how the program itself is going to address the needs that you have. Given this, then, it's really important to be able to clearly delineate how every action you take as part of the program helps get you towards the change that you need to get to. We would also think it's a good idea next to create a visual representation of this. We refer to these as the logic models. A couple of things to keep in mind for those of you who may be relatively new to logic models, right? You should have logic models that address the needs of the audience that you're trying to specify. This probably will mean, as a coalition, that you will have multiple logic models. Certainly your evaluator, your evaluation team will have a logic model that will contain probably everything possible on it so that they can track the data that they're collecting. But you also may want more simplified versions of the logic model depending on what your audience is. It's also important to remember, because I know a lot of you have been trained, that logic models basically have 3 pieces, right? One is the problem statement, the next are the risk factors, and the next are local conditions. But I also think that it's very important to include on a logic model the consequence data that you're tracking, right? Because why are we in fact addressing these problems if not to decrease the consequence? So for me, the real litmus test about a program is it making the community a better place to live? And it can only make the community a better place to live if it's decreasing the negative consequences with the issues that we're trying to address. So we want to make sure that we're including as much information as possible given what the audience needs, and we want to make sure that these are user-friendly. Okay. Then the last part of this process then is clearly identifying goals, objectives, and the criteria for success, right? What's the overall goal of the program? What are some specific goals relating to objectives that we have? And then the last is, how do we know when we get there, right? Is there a point at which we need to build into the system a conversation where we start asking, do we need to shift resources into another place right now? Have we put enough resources into this issue? So it's important to have some type of conversation pertaining to the evaluation around this idea of, have we gone far enough, so that you can build in that conversation as you move forward. All right. So these first two steps that we talked about, engaging stakeholders and describing the program, are very strongly linked to the ideas of capacity and planning under, say, the Strategic Prevention Framework or the SPIF-SIG model. And these are things that coalitions typically can do pretty well on their own because they're used to trying to engage stakeholders. They're used to developing logic models or theories of change and all that. And so you're going to take those skills and you're going to apply them just to the evaluation. The next step of the model is where we really start to, I think, get into more specialized skill sets, right? And under focusing evaluation design, primarily what we're concerned with here is, how do you measure and understand what you do, right? How are you going to figure out if you've been effective? Notice that it's not the next phase, which is gathering that information. This is the phase in which you're going to design in advance what it is that you're going to do. And as I said, this is typically where we get into more specialized skills. So let's give you some examples of what that might look like in terms of those steps. The first step here is to create evaluation questions. And these evaluation questions go beyond the goals and objectives that you did earlier, right? Those goals and objectives typically are the numerical places you're trying to hit. These broad goals, broad objectives, reduce substance use, things like that. Those big, broad, macro-oriented. But there might be specific questions that funders or that other folks, other stakeholders have that you can answer along the way. All right. And this is where we take that information on identifying stakeholders and then figuring out what they're interested in, and we start to articulate these into evaluation questions. Important, though, to not develop too many evaluation questions. You don't want to be distracted by doing too much, right? We have limited resources for evaluation. So it's very important, as you get these list of evaluation questions that stakeholders have, that you're able to prioritize what they are and then pick from that list the most important questions that you need to answer. Sometimes you may find that you'll get questions that, simply put, that the evaluation, the way it's designed, cannot answer them, and maybe it will take a lot of resources to answer them. These are all ideas that you should be throwing around while you're trying to prioritize. Is it reasonable to answer these questions? And if we answer these questions, are they going to be useful? How are they going to be used? That should be part of the discussion of creating evaluation questions. We are going to be doing a tips video on creating evaluation questions. There are very specific steps that we can help you out with. And that should be coming up within the next month or so. After you create those evaluation questions, we want to start articulating the roles and responsibilities, obviously, so we know who's supposed to do what. After that, we want to plan for the collection, analysis, interpretation of required data. And again, this is really the heart, I think, of the special skill set. This is where you need folks. It's helpful to have folks at the table who have some type of well-developed skills, because you notice that there are a couple different steps in this step, right? We need to have some skills around how we're going to collect data. We need to have some skills around how we're going to analyze that data, because certainly different kinds of data requires different kinds of analysis. And then, of course, we're also going to have to interpret the data that we have. And when we say interpret the data what we have, this is, I think, a really well-defined skill set for folks who are well practiced in doing coalition or community level evaluation, because that's a little bit different than doing smaller program evaluation, right? Typically, smaller program evaluation has a minimal number of variables that have to be accounted for when you're interpreting the data and making generalized conclusions about the overall effectiveness of the program. That's very different in a community where there's all kinds of variables. You start have to make decisions about which variables count, which ones should we be using, how much weight should we be giving to these variables, and then only after doing that and looking at all the goals, objectives, and other questions that are being addressed, coming up with some type of interpretation on what all that means. It's just a much more complex, I think, system to work in when you're looking at the community level, which is why it's so important to have people on your evaluation team who have expertise in community evaluation, not just what we would define as individual or small group program evaluation. And then, because we are involved at the community level in long-term evaluation processes, again, this might be a little bit different than individual or small group programs. Community level programs take a long time. This is not a 6-week effort, right? This often takes years. And because it takes years, there are going to be revisions to the program. So we need to think about in advance how we are going to build in revisions to the evaluation plan as we move forward. And when I say we need to think about how that's going to happen, basically we're thinking about who are going to be the decision makers and who are the folks that are going to decide how things get revised. So we got 2 choice points here. Who's going to recognize when a revision is necessary, and then who are going to be the folks that take the necessary action steps to actually revise the plan, and then finally to approve it. So we want to think about that in advance so that we're not caught off guard. We definitely, almost always, from my experience, are involved in revisions to evaluation plans. So that's focusing the design. As I said, that's a specialized set of skills. I also think that this is also another set of specialized skills, this gathering credible evidence, right? And gathering credible evidence, we want to basically make sure that the information is genuine. We don't want to be drawing false conclusions or drawing conclusions that are based on data that is not accurately representing the concepts, ideas, and behaviors that we're trying to measure. So when we are going to gather credible evidence, a couple of things that we can do to help with that. First is data triangulation. For those of you who are not clear on what that means, it basically means we're going to be collecting different kinds of data. Usually this is broken into 2 categories, qualitative and quantitative data, and we do have a 5-minute training into practice or tips video that we've already done on this topic, on the use of qualitative and quantitative data and why it's important to triangulate your data. The next process is one that, in my experience, a lot of folks fall a little short on, and this is meta evaluation. I think we fall short on it for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which, by the way, is that evaluators, even if you have paid evaluators, it's not likely that your paid evaluator wants outsiders looking at the evaluation. Uh, it's just, but think about this as a quality control, and meta evaluation does in fact mean that. Are there outsiders who can look at the evaluation? Does it make sense? So you want to think about who should be the folks that look this over. Certainly you may have members of the evaluation team. If you have an evaluation subcommittee, for example, there are going to be folks, but they're already involved in the evaluation. You would like someone to be able to look at the evaluation through a different lens, through a different set of eyes. Does it make sense to them? It's always a good idea to have folks from the community, for example, or to have stakeholders who are not directly involved in the evaluation take a look at the evaluation. Because we want to make sure that the evaluation process makes sense to the stakeholders. Because if the process doesn't make sense to the stakeholders, then no matter what kind of data you pull from that process, there is a credibility issue that you may have to address. So it's just helpful maybe every 6 months or so to have a few folks, maybe 1, 2, or 3 folks, depending on what your resources are, who are outside of the evaluation process and can help evaluators make the process better, fit the community needs more. So meta evaluation is, by the way, a consistent theme through all the skill sets and through all parts of the framework. So meta evaluation, a critical piece, are outsiders looking over what your evaluation team is doing. Also, when it comes to data, we want to make sure that we're having mutually reinforcing data. What that means is one piece of data supports another piece of data. We talked about triangulation, and you can never have one single piece of data to measure a concept. But if we're going to collect multiple pieces of information around one concept or idea, we want to make sure that all of the data is pointing us in the same direction. What I mean by that is if we're using rates and distributions from a survey and we ask people if 30-day use of some substance is going up or down, and on the survey it clearly indicates after 5 years that rates of use are going down. But when we talk to key stakeholders in the community, like those involved in the school district or the police department or folks who are providers, substance abuse, mental health providers in the community, and they all say it's going up, well, now we have some type of data issue that needs to be resolved, right? Why do we have some data saying it's going up, other data saying it's going down? That's a really simple example, but remember, under mutually reinforcing, we're trying to build a case and we're trying to show that we can account for any anomalies in the data, and we're also trying to show kind of what's the general trend of the data. Where's that data going? What does that concept look like according to the data that we have? So we want to make sure that it's mutually reinforcing as well. So that's gathering credible evidence. Now, after we focused the design and then in the process actually started gathering all of that evidence and information, we want to be able to justify conclusions, which is the next step. And under justifying conclusions, we want to show and frame the context of the findings. Right? We want to be able to demonstrate how we got to where we got to, but we also want to be able to explain how we got there. It's not just talking about where we are, but it's talking about how we got there under justifying the conclusions. So let's talk about the steps then that we will engage in. One is getting people involved, and getting people involved to reach some type of consensus about the conclusions we're drawing from the data. This is related again to the meta evaluation piece, where we're going to have people who perhaps are outside the evaluation, but stakeholders who are going to look at the data, look at the process we engaged in, and then talk through with us what they think that information means when we pull it together. What we want to avoid is a lot of disagreement when we get to the presentation phase, right? We want to make sure that when we're presenting our data, when we're presenting the conclusions for that data, that there's general agreement, certainly within the coalitions and certainly at least at the stakeholder level, because we need a consistent message to the community on what the evaluation means. Next is accounting for alternative explanations. There's all kinds of stuff that can go on in a community during the course of this program and the evaluation for it. All kinds of crazy variables may have some type of an impact on the needs that we're trying to address. And it is possible that there are folks who are not working with the coalition, for example, who have done something in the community that impacts the needs we're trying to address, but had nothing to do with us. It's important for us to keep track of that. There also might be events in the community. This often happens unfortunately, I guess, with tragedies, for example, in a community. If there are a string of deaths, or if the consequences for some type of behavior are suddenly viewed as being much larger than they were before, then fewer people are likely to engage in that behavior, at least for a short period of time. Remembering here that we are interested in contribution, right? Um, Not attribution. That is to say that probably at the community level, no set of interventions, no matter how complete, can solely account for the changes that you see. There are going to be other things that happen, so we need to be able to make the argument that what we did made a difference, even if we can't specify exactly what that numerical value of the difference was. So we want to make sure to account for alternative explanations, and one of the things that also helps us with credibility here is comparing data trends. What does data look like in similar communities, or maybe in broader communities that include the community that you're in? So if you are, for example, working in a school district and that's your community, it might be helpful to look at this data as a piece of broader county data, maybe. Or if you're working at the county level, it may be important to look at the counties that are around you. What has the data look like in those counties, so that you get a better feel? I'll give you a quick example on how that might be important. Suppose you are targeting um, substance use, maybe it's marijuana use, and you do a lot in your county to target marijuana use. And after 2-year evaluation of your massive program, you thought you were doing a lot of good, but some of the data is coming back and it's saying that marijuana use has actually gone up 5% for the grade levels that you were targeting. Well, on its own, you may view that as a failure. You may say, oh, we got a problem because we wanted rates to go down and they've gone up. But if you look at similar communities, or you look at surrounding communities, and you find out, for example, that marijuana use has gone up 25% everywhere else, well, then that's important to have a conversation about what your 5% increase means in light of similar communities who have gone up a lot more. Maybe you have had an impact, even though your target was to drop it down, but maybe your community is doing better off than other communities. It may or may not be true. What's important is that you're able to have a conversation about that. If you're not comparing data trends, then you will miss that conversation. And then the last element under here is making sure that we're limiting the finding to the current context. And current context, what we mean by that is your current space and time that you are in. What are the lessons learned? What worked well and why, given where we are at this point? Another good example on how this might play out. Recently worked with a coalition who was frustrated because they had a lot of trouble getting people to the table, a lot of trouble getting people to volunteer. And as I was talking to this person, they indicated, I don't understand what went wrong, because 6-7 years ago, we were highly effective. We never had to worry about this. People were coming out to help us in droves. We never had a shortage of volunteers. Meetings were always busy and were very productive. And I asked the question, well, what's different now than what was happening then? And unfortunately, this person's answer was, well, I don't know. And the reason that this person didn't know, of course, is because they weren't having those conversations under their evaluation plan about the context of what was working and why. If the evaluation team or the evaluator had started to gather some of that information and started creating those conversations about, hey, let's talk about why this is working right now, or maybe talking about why this isn't working right now, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, when things change, you're able to have conversations comparing then to now. It's important to remember that all of the findings that you have right now are a byproduct of where you are in space and time, right? There are certain events, certain people, certain agencies that are doing certain things, and these will all impact where you find yourself. So it's important to try to at least articulate what some of that context is. What does that look like? What are the things going on that are helping us succeed? What are the things going on that are challenging us right now? in the hopes of learning as we move forward so that we can continue to try to decrease the amount of things that hinder us and increase the types of things in context that help us. So that's justifying conclusions. After we justify conclusions, we want to get to this last part, which seems pretty easy on its face: use and share lessons learned, right? And a lot of coalition folks say that they would like to be able to do this better. What I would like to offer here is this is not just telling what you did in a report, right? This is not just about, do I use charts or graphs? Do I use PowerPoint? Do I use some type of letter? Often, this is the kind of conversation that I've seen coalitions engage in when they think about reporting out what they found. So let's talk about what the CDC recommends in terms of reporting out. First is, one of the most important themes that we want to report out on is the utility of the evaluation and the utility of the program itself. Are we meeting the goals for both, right? Are we collecting the kind of data that is helpful to our stakeholders and to the community? It's good to have this conversation. And again, I think probably the best way to have this conversation is to keep the stakeholders engaged as you move forward. There should be no surprises by the time you get to the conclusion section, right? Or the time that you're reporting to stakeholders what you found out, because you have kept them engaged along the way. That means even when you don't have anything that you think is worthy of reporting, you may report out some process issues to them. Tell them about the challenges and the successes, even if they're minor, that you're having as you move along, right? We do that because we want to make sure that if there's a place where a stakeholder wants to red flag or wants to identify, hey, do you think you could look at this? Or, hey, I have an idea about how you might be able to do that better. They have the opportunity to help us. So we want to keep the stakeholders engaged as we move forward to make sure that we're meeting this goal of utility. We also want to have follow-up meetings with the groups that we're reporting to. I know this sounds like a simple thing, but it's critically important to the evaluation process, and it's critically important for two reasons. The first is we want to make sure that after we give people the information, that they understand it. How many times have you been involved in a conversation where you say one thing, but the person you're talking to thinks you meant something else? We don't want folks doing that with our evaluation findings. We want to make sure that when we report out the process and the data that we have and the conclusions that we have, that the recipient of that information understands where we are coming from and what it is. So we're going to give them some time to digest that information. We're going to give them whatever tools they need to take it with them and look it over. And then we're going to schedule a follow-up meeting, even if it's a town hall. This is a useful tool, not just having a town hall that presents data, but then having a follow-up town hall where people have the chance to come back with questions or issues that they had around the data. People need time to digest it. The other reason we're going to have follow-up meetings is because we're interested in the utility of the information. We want to give our stakeholders an opportunity to use the information within their agency or organization or group. We don't just want to hand the data over to them and say, okay, good luck, see ya, and then we never know if they actually use it. We want to be able to sit down with them a relatively reasonable time later, maybe 3 to 6 months afterwards, and say, hey, this information that we gave you, how are you using it? Are you able to use it? This way also, by the way, we can start reminding them of the benefits of the data for them. It's possible, and my experience says quite probable, that they will take the data and shove it in a desk drawer, and they'll just, when you're presenting it, they'll be like, oh, that's really interesting, and then it just kind of gets thrown away because they're just trying to get through their daily grind of doing their job the way that they would always do it. I think it's important to bring them back to the table again and give them ideas on how they might be able to use that data. Right? What can you do with it? So we're going to schedule follow-up meetings. The other thing that this is going to do when we provide these two opportunities of making sure we're clarifying the meaning and making sure that we are clarifying the utility of it is we're also improving the overall quality of our evaluation. We're also, by the way, gaining more involved partnerships along the way, right? Because people start recognizing that what you're doing is important. And then the last piece of this is including not just the numbers or the data, but also including what I refer to as the rationales and the reasons. Why did we make the decisions that we made? Why does the evaluation process look the way it does? Why did we decide on this particular set of data as opposed to a different set of data? It's important to explain all of that in an evaluation. Now, of course, you can also determine which stakeholders get which pieces of these rationales or reasons, because not everyone's going to be interested in every part of the process. But it's also important for future evaluation protocols and for future programs that everyone understands, again, the context within which decisions were made. Why did we do it this way? It may help us be more efficient and more effective when we move forward. I think the biggest gap that I've seen in evaluation findings is the lessons learned about the process, that people are not clearly articulating their rationales and reasons. So when you are achieving successes, it's hard for people to figure out where those successes came from. It's just really important to describe why you're doing what you're doing so that others can follow if it works and avoid mistakes if it doesn't. So given all these are all the steps then. We've gone through all of them, and we see that some of them are more amenable to what a coalition currently does. Some of them seem to require specialized skill sets. Within all of this, and something that I've reiterated as we've gone through here, we are trying to tell the story about what we've done, right? We're trying to tell the story about where the need came from, what we've done to address the need, and then how we measured the need and the program to figure out if we've been effective. What impact have we had? That's all part of a story. And in telling the story, I like to think of two parts to this telling the story. One is the elements needed to tell the story. Who are the major characters? What are the things being done? The other is how did we reach conclusions? Once we put all of those characters and all of that information together, what does it then look like? How can you then use this framework to tell your coalition story more clearly, right? To talk more clearly with stakeholders about what it is that you're doing. And I think the way that a coalition can do this is to think of each part of the framework as being responsible for a different part of the story. And if we look at these three areas, engage stakeholders, describe the program, use and share lessons learned, these are the parts of the story that help us tell what we've done, right? That's different than the other three elements of parts of the framework, which are really all about how do we gather the information and then tell it, right? So when we're talking about engaging stakeholders, describing the program, using and sharing lessons learned, this is the part of the storytelling itself. So one of the things I think it's important to figure out is, are we telling our story in a really accurate way, or are we having challenges with that? And if we're having challenges telling our story, is it because we don't have the pieces of information that we need? Or is it because we have pieces of information, but we're not quite sure how to put it all together into one coherent story? Maybe it's both, but I think it's important to be able to distinguish where you should be putting your resources in terms of telling the story. So based on that, I've designed this worksheet, which I gave out during the webinar, and you could certainly drop me an email if you're watching this and you would like a copy of this. We should have a website up pretty soon that will contain this information. But you would notice on the sheet that the first three elements, if you look at the first column, these are each step of the framework: engaging stakeholders, program description, ensuring use and lessons learned, focusing, evaluation, design, gathering credible evidence, justifying conclusions. And what I did is I divided these into two different sets. So you'll notice that the next column are the behaviors that we talked about. For example, in engaging stakeholders, you identify the stakeholders, you clarify the stakeholder interests, you demonstrate the benefit, you show stakeholders how they can help with the evaluation. So what you would do for each action is you would score your coalition on each action. And on the very top, it explains the scoring system. Excellent equals 3, pretty good equals 2, not that good 1, and not good at all 0. So if you were not very good at identifying stakeholders, you may give yourself a score of 1 under that particular activity. Each section then is made up of 4 action steps, which means you can get 12 points per section. So you can identify which sections you're stronger at than others. And then down the bottom, I've created spaces for subscores. The first subscore is called telling the story, right? And that's the engaging stakeholders, describing the program, ensuring use, and lessons learned. I'm just going to add up those subtotals for those 3 categories. And then I'm going to add up the subtotals for the other 3 categories, focusing the design, credible evidence, and justifying conclusions. And then that way, I should be able to at least begin or initiate a more informed conversation with the coalition and other stakeholders around, if we want to tell our story, what do we have to improve on the most, right? Do we have all the information that we really need and it's just difficult for us to articulate it? Or are we really good at articulating the information, but we're just not getting the information that we need to be able to do that? So this score sheet should help advance that conversation and help you tell your story using this framework. So a quick review. Here was the all the stuff that we did during this webinar. Whew, can't believe we made it through. The next webinar, I know you're not supposed to do anything. My 10-year-old daughter, who has her own YouTube channel, tells me that you should never do anything that dates your YouTube stuff, but here's a date on the YouTube stuff. August 10th, 2016. For those of you who are watching before that time is our next webinar. I have collected some ideas for topics, but if you do have topics, please, please, please pass them along to me. I'll tell you how to get a hold of me in just a moment. If you have not yet subscribed to our channel, obviously you know what the channel is if you're watching this video, but please subscribe. Don't forget to comment and like on videos. Give us some advice if you'd like, on how we can make this better. But for those of you who don't know, the good news about subscribing to the channel is you actually get updates when a new video is added, and it kind of tells you what the title of the new video is and all that stuff, so you know when to check us out. So I'd like to thank you all for listening. I know it's not easy to do sometimes. If you need help, please contact me. You can reach me at wgeary, that's WGEARY, at globalevaluationsolutions.com. And you can also leave comments here. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Hopefully you can make the next webinar. And as the music says, the Eagles, as a 2-time coalition coordinator, I know how crazy things can get. Just remember, don't let the sound of your own wheels drive you crazy. Bye-bye, everybody.